So welcome back, everybody. I'm here again with Neeshee Pandit of atmaastrology.com, and we're continuing our series on Ayurveda. And today we're going to be specifically looking into how the planets of Vedic astrology relate to the 5 elements utilized in Ayurveda. So welcome back, Neeshee. It's good to see you again.
Thanks for having me again, Ryan. Good to see you as well.
Yeah. So you remember what we discussed last time? We were going over the elements, and really I'm just going to turn it over to you. When you're thinking about the elements and you're thinking about astrology, how do these things relate? How do they tie together?
Okay, well, last time we talked about, we've talked about 5 elements. We've talked about prana and its 3 aspects. We've talked about the 3 doshas and how all of those are related to each other. Mm-hmm. And now the key point we want to make is that all of this factors into astrology because all the planets can be seen as being related to elements, prana, and doshas.
Right.
So this is the import of Ayurveda and astrology, is to see how everything can be understood in those terms, especially planets. So we can run through it very systematically and then also just discuss some of the meaning of those things.
Sure.
We'll see where it goes.
Sounds good.
So the 5 elements again: ether, air, fire, water, and earth. And that's in order of density, from most subtle to most concrete. So I'm going to discuss this more in just the order of the planets as they're traditionally given, which is Sun through Saturn. Mm-hmm. That doesn't necessarily reflect the order of the elements. It just reflects the order of the planets as we traditionally discuss them, which has its own logic. So people shouldn't get confused about the order of things. It's going to get totally switched up when you start looking at things through different paradigms. Mm-hmm. So now we're in astrological paradigm. So Sun is fire element.
Wait, did you feel that? All right, sorry. I felt that shift into astrological paradigm. It was weird. All right, go ahead.
Here we go. All right, the shift has happened. So we're in astrological territory now. So we're going to start with the Sun. And the Sun is obviously fire element for all kinds of reasons. I mean, it's the fiery planet. It's a bright planet. It's literally a blazing star. It's a source of light and energy for the solar system, for all the planets. The Sun is fire element. So that's a really clear, concrete connection.
Right. It's obvious.
Obvious.
Yes.
And you can, talk for an hour about the meaning of all of that, but we're not going to get into all of that right now. Mm-hmm. The moon is comprised of 2 elements, which is water and air.
Okay.
And that's interesting to understand because the moon is water for, again, obvious reasons. We know that the moon's gravitational pull affects the ocean tides, and what that really means is that the moon is affecting the flow of water or the flow of things in general. So medically, the moon's also affecting the flow of the fluids in our body. The moon governs our circulatory system. It's making sure that the watery components of our life are moving the way they're supposed to move. And because it has that motility associated with it, that's where the air element comes in. Water is just the density itself. It's just the substance. And air is the mover of substances. That's why we say that the moon is comprised of water and air, both.
Okay, because it's the substance and it's also the motivator to move that substance around.
Right. It's really the flow.
Okay.
But it's the flow of something. It's not just the flow itself.
Right. And that's specific the idea of the elements rather than thinking of the fact that the moon changes, is changeable, has the phases of the moon. Is that, I always thought maybe that's what made it have that airy quality.
Totally right. You're totally right. The moon is always shifting. It's always moving. Mm-hmm. That's its air quality. And that's what creates a change in the flow of things. Right. Mm-hmm. So it's totally right.
Okay.
Okay. Sun, Moon, Mars.
Mm-hmm.
Mars is fire element again. And there's a lot we could say if we wanted to get into a whole discussion of the Sun and Mars and how they're different types of fire and so forth. I think that might be beyond the scope of this video, but the Sun and Mars are both fire element planets in different ways, mm-hmm. but they both have that quality of fire.
Well, what's a general, and we don't need to get into it because you're right, it will take a long time. We could probably spend the whole class just on the difference between those two. But just in general, when people think about Mars and when they think about the sun, what's a basic kind of quality that would be still heat, still fire, but one would be more specific to Mars and one would be more specific to the sun, so people could think about that a little bit.
Okay. Well, I would say that the sun is like more of a primal fire. You know, it's like Agni itself.
Okay.
And Mars is more like Pitta.
Okay.
You know, and Agni like is necessary for Pitta to be what it is. Like there's a whole traditional discussion of, you know, is Agni in Pitta or is Pitta in Agni? You know, that's a whole Ayurvedic discussion. And so if you contemplate that enough, you can get to see the relationship between the fire that is the sun and the fire that is Mars. So the way I look at it is that the fire of Mars actually grows out of the sun. So the sun is more primal. It's more at the root.
Okay.
And it's giving rise to the fire that's Mars. So in a way, it's fueling the fire that's Mars. Mars is a more concrete manifestation of the fire element that is the sun.
Right. Yeah. And when I think of Mars, you know, since Mars is represented by the idea of skills and logic and accomplishing things, sort of makes sense that maybe Mars, or not Mars, the sun is that that initial light, that initial fire, that initial energy, and Mars is the aspect or the channel for that to put it to use. Because when I think about Mars, I think about putting things to use or creating things.
Exactly.
So two different kinds of fire there.
Yeah, the sun is potentiality in that sense, and Mars is the utilization of that potentiality.
Okay.
There's something similar between that and the moon and some of the other planets that have the same element. But we really see that with the sun and Mars sharing fire element. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of meaning the more you consider that. So Mercury's earth element. And how do we understand that? Well, Mercury has within it, you know, Mercury is also tridoshic. I'm crossing into some doshic territory now, but that's what it is. Yeah. Mercury is also tridoshic for that reason, because Mercury really has, you see, this is where it can get a little confusing. So I want to just mention that at the outset, that sometimes the dosha and the element don't match.
Okay.
Okay. And why that is, there's reasons for that. One of those reasons is that looking at things through different points of view yields like different understandings, and the traditional classification of the planets according to elements and doshas, in other words, doesn't totally match up. Okay. So like Mercury is an earth, associated with earth element, but doshically it's not, we're not saying it's kapha.
Right. Which
would be kind of the logical sequence there. Like, oh, okay, earth element, that's like a kapha element, so Mercury should be kapha. But it's not. It's everything. And the way to understand that is earth element is the most concrete. It's the last element. And so it contains within it all the elements that precede it. So similarly, Mercury is mixed, and it contains within it all of the doshas. So that's the way to understand it.
Right. So Mercury becomes tridoshic just because. Well, so then I guess my other question, because this is something that came up a lot when Corey Dowds and I were teaching for the Ayurvedic program at the Asheville School of Yoga and Massage. You know, we were talking about different ascendants, and you know there are multiple ascendants that have an earth element associated to it. Mm-hmm. But we would specifically focus on Virgo as being a tridoshic ascendant because of its earth element, but you've also got other signs which are also earth elements, but they're not always, unless, I mean, I'm curious what you think about that. We don't always just consider them tridoshic. It's the focus on Mercury's sign usually, isn't it?
Yeah, I think you're right about that.
Okay.
It's really Mercury that has that unique tridoshic quality to it. Even though the other Rashis that are earth element are tridoshic also. Well, except for, I'm going to take that back a little bit. We'll get into that later.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's especially true of Mercury, because think about Capricorn. Capricorn is another earth element Rashi, but it's ruled by Saturn. Saturn is air element. So that mixes in with that. You see, so it's not like you can say, oh, Capricorn people are going to be tridoshic. Now they might be a little bit more than like Aquarius people, okay? But they still got a Saturn ruled ascendant, and so that air quality is definitely going to come in there.
Right.
Whereas with Mercury, it's already, you know, it's already kind of mixed.
Right, just because of Mercury's character. So we're looking at the character of the planet Mercury, and that's why it's different. Say for Saturn ruled ascendant, it's an Earth sign, and also the Venus. You know, the Venus ascendant, it's also an Earth sign. So okay, all right. I just wanted to bring that up because that was something that kept popping up in regards to questions, and
yeah, totally.
We came to a similar conclusion that you did. But whenever I think of the Earth element, I always do think of the fact that it seems like it should have not just a kapha influence, but a tridoshic influence because of the fact that it contains all of the elements. But anyway, that's just a little discussion on the side. So
yeah, the more we understand how planets augment the rashis and so forth, and the dynamic of that interaction, the more we can judge, you know, with more accuracy. So that's good. It's good you brought that up with Mercury and everything, because that's a big part of what Mercury is this mixed quality. So Mercury, then Jupiter. Now we see a similar thing happening with Jupiter, which is associated with ether element, but doshically it's associated with kapha. Okay, so those are like kind of two ends of the spectrum.
Right. Very different.
Yeah, it's associated with ether because Jupiter is that planet that is the closest to spirit, you know, the closest to consciousness. It is that pure expression of spirituality, of wisdom, of truth, of joy, you know? And in that sense, it is like the healthy side of Vata, you know? Like healthy Vata is experienced as flow, as joy, as bliss. You know, a lot of like healthy Vata people, you know, are into meditation because it's like something where they feel that flow is like happening for them readily. Also, a lot of unhealthy Vata people are into meditation and they're just tweaking out, you know? So that's, I see something about Jupiter as being like a healthy Vata. And that's ether element, you know, it is that space from which everything is happening. But it's also the heaviest planet, you know, it's also Guru in the sense of being heavy. And having weight. And so that's the kapha aspect of Jupiter. You know, and for the same reason Jupiter rules like fat, the fat tissue and so forth. It's like there is this quality of Jupiter that's not just consciousness, but that is the substance of embodiment.
Right. You know, it's really good that you brought up in the very beginning how you're going to be looking at this from different perspectives, because you're right. Jupiter is an excellent example. We have Jupiter being associated with the ether element, the ability to hear, a space, and so on. But it is Guru, which is heavy, which gives the kapha nature. But then again, we can also look to see that the two signs that Jupiter rules over, one is a fire sign and one is a water sign. So we're going to be we're going to be seeing this come up in multiple ways. The differences there.
And also, if you think about Jupiter as guru, you know, in terms of like the spiritual master, well, it makes sense because the spiritual master is the embodied expression of the spiritual reality. You know, the spiritual master embodies consciousness, embodies realization, embodies spirit. So they're like the kapha of ether, you know. So there's that play with Jupiter.
Yeah. Exactly.
Now where are we going? Okay, Venus.
Yeah.
Now Venus is water and air also, traditionally, and Venus is kapha, not kapha and vata or anything. I'm pulling in doshas now.
That's okay. That's going to be 2 videos from now, but it's all right. But they can come back and re-listen. Yeah.
It's hard to ultimately separate these things. So.
Yeah. So okay. So let's get back then. The actual element for Venus is what? You said water?
Water and air.
Water and air.
And air. Yeah. Now some people will say it's just water, but if you look at the actual text, it's water and air. So it says mirroring the moon.
Right.
And the more we understand, you know, anatomy and physiology and what these planets actually govern in our bodies, the more we'll understand that connection between the moon and Venus. But water makes sense for Venus because Venus is associated with the vital essence or the reproductive fluid, what we call shukra. And so that's a watery, that's a water element dominant substance. Okay.
Right.
And Venus governs flow in a different way than the moon does. You know, Venus is governing the flow that you need to have healthy vitality, you know, and the flow that comes from, you know, making positive choices in life, from health and well-being. The flow that rejuvenates you is Venus, right?
Right.
Whereas the flow that maintains your life in general is going to be the moon.
So is that similar? Is that similar, like the idea between Sun and Mars? So now instead of Sun we have the moon, and instead of Mars we have Venus. So the moon is that sort of primordial fact that you're alive, and Venus is what's happening within that life.
Venus is the realization of that foundation element. So yeah, Venus realizes or crystallizes that energy of the moon, and that's understood as being the vital essence. Then the product of that is Ojas. That's a whole video in and of itself. You know, Ojas is a whole concept that should be understood. That's really profound, and that reveals a lot about the planets too. We won't get into that right now, but exactly what you just said. Venus is the maturity of that life force. And so when that life force is realized, when the flow of energy and the flow of fluids is realized, we're rejuvenated by life. Okay? So that's Venus. And the air element still has to be there because there's still a process around it. There's still a dynamic in that. It's not static.
Right. And we're looking at the air element in this regard as movement, but also as like the intelligence behind what's directing the flow of life, or the flow of the water element.
That's right. Exactly.
Okay. So Venus is water and air, just like the moon.
That's right.
Got it.
And if you think about, you know, the reproductive system and the reproductive fluids, they are, you know, moving fluids. You know, they're not just like a blob. It's like they are moving in the body. And so that's why Venus is also water and air. So, you know, it's interesting because the more you think about the planets, the more you realize that they're just, you know, in a sense, an expression of our own anatomy, an expression of our own, the structures of our very being, you know, at physical levels, spiritual levels. They're just describing reality in a lot of ways. So Venus, Saturn. Saturn is air element. That's it, just air. And, you know, Saturn's also the farthest from the sun. Saturn's a cold planet. An air element is typically associated with cold. Saturn also can introduce a lot of changes in people's lives. It's, you know, it's rough. You know, the qualities of air are also rough, coarse, unstable.
Right.
Another way of looking at it, air is not a stable element. It's constantly in change. Right. So it's hard to find a lot of fulfillment and happiness with those kinds of things because it's never fixed enough for you to really be able to relate to. It's a process of life that's always having to change and transform. Okay.
And so, well, you know, that you can say a lot about that in and of itself. But when we're thinking about the planets, so we've got two fire planets, Mars and Sun. Got two air and water planets, which are Moon and Venus. And then Mercury is the Earth.
Right.
Jupiter is ether, and Saturn is air as well, correct?
Right.
Okay. So it's interesting that there's two planets, Moon and Sun, that both have two elements associated with them, but the rest of them only have one associated with it. I'm just kind of curious because when I think about the whole idea of life and being alive, and since Moon and Venus are so associated with that, that wind, that air has to be there in order for life to develop through the water element. And with Saturn, Saturn being air, as you just described, and you were starting to go into the idea of it being change. And I think a lot of people see Saturn as being sort of like this stagnant, fixed symbol of death.
Right.
Right. And I think what a lot of times they sort of miss or forget is that, Saturn's exaltation position is in, and maybe we talked about this before, but it's in Libra, which is the seventh sign.
Mhm.
And the seventh sign is as far away from us as we can get. And that's where it's said that trade occurs. So transformation of energy, losing one thing to get another. And it seems like for life to happen, there always has to be this kind of overturning, this birth and death and decay and growing from that and so on. And I don't think people see that enough when they think about Saturn. They see it more as just, there's a pile of manure over there, but they don't realize that that pile of manure is going to, fertilize a field so that we have crops.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The more that we take the perspective of just mere gross embodiment, the more we miss out on the subtle dynamics that's actually governing our life. And Saturn is really one of those things. I mean, it's a profound planet. It has a huge influence, and it's usually met with frustration, consternation, and as this sort of like heavy obstacle in the path. But that's not, I think what you're saying is totally right on, because if we think about Saturn as air element, it's a totally different scene.
Right.
Right. And the fact that it's exalted in Venus's sign, and the fact that, Venus has that air element as being part of it, and so does the moon. So it shows that our life force has this necessity to it, of change, of movement, of transformation, of dynamic. And that's what Saturn is really exemplifying.
Right. And what I always found interesting was the fact that if you kind of take the zodiac and you pair it up by chakras, with Saturn signs being the first chakra, then Jupiter second, Mars third, Venus fourth, Mercury fifth, and then Cancer and Leo's being the sixth. What I always found interesting was that Saturn is exalted in the positive polarity dynamic of the heart chakra, and the moon is exalted in the feminine or even polarity of the heart chakra. And they both have to mutually Rashi aspect each other.
Right.
And I always found, I like thinking about sort of what the ideal dynamics are of planets based on, where their exaltation positions are and how they can aspect each other, like what those dynamics are if you would take those planets and stick them in their exaltation positions. Well, you wouldn't think, at least I wouldn't think, that a moon Saturn kind of energy would be the kind of energy that would kind of stimulate a heart chakra experience. But if you think about it, it makes sense, because the heart chakra is that pouring out of love, and Saturn is a planet that is concerned about the masses, and the moon is the planet that keeps you attuned to kind of the needs of others. You kind of stick those two things together, and well, anyway, when I think about
it, makes perfect sense. Like my guru often spoke about what he called the wound of love. And he described love as like a wound that never heals, basically. That's just the nature of love, is that there's this inherent wound in existence, and that love is a radiant wound, that the blossoming of the heart chakra there is this woundedness in it. The pain of life is fully felt in it. And yet there's this realization of love in the midst of that, that doesn't not see the pain. It's not like Saturn disappears, Saturn is totally there. But that's like part of what love is. And so I think what you just said, more we understand like the relationship between planets and chakras, and the signs and chakras and exaltation points, there's just so much being revealed about life.
Right. And what you mentioned, Saturn disappearing, it's not even Saturn, that's one way of looking at it, is this idea of Saturn disappearing. But on the other hand, when we think about Saturn, remembering he's the air element, I think oftentimes people have problems with him because they expect him to be that heaviness that is not necessarily inherent in the air elements. They take whatever the Saturnine issue is, and they kind of like try to turn it into a concrete thing. So rather than going out into the world and feeling and being compassionate through the pain one has experienced, they tend to sort of become more bitter and dark and stagnant, and that's where that Saturn gets heavy. But that's not how an exalted Saturn functions.
That's right.
Right. So I think there's the more we think about this kind of stuff, the more we can start to realize what are the planets in their highest qualities. So I think it's good to think about what you mentioned with the air element, the fact that Saturn is about movement and change, and that is also death, because that is a type of change.
Right.
And then people could consider how can they keep, I know they don't want to, but how can they keep Saturn alive? I think that's part of the issue. How do you keep Saturn alive is that change and that momentum, rather than trying to lock it down and turn it into something to be bitter over, but that's the difficulty of life.
Saturn is a key, major key to life and
Right.
unlocking the life force, and sacrifice is a necessary component of love.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what Saturn is really about. And there's just all kinds of expressions of that. Sex is like one expression of love, but there's also a whole range of higher expressions of love that maybe have nothing even to do with embodiment, that are just spiritual in nature even. So you can look at a whole spectrum,
Yeah.
So that's good. It's good to think about Saturn. People need to spend more time meditating on Saturn, really.
Yeah, well, you're probably right. But anyway, okay. So we've gone through the planets with the elements, and next up, we'll go ahead and we'll take some time to discuss the idea that you brought up in the second video we did on this series on prana and the planets. So before we get to that, is there anything else you'd like to say or share about what we've covered today? Or do you think we got to what we needed to get to?
I think we got to what we need to get to. There's Rahu and Ketu, which that's a funny.
Do you want to talk about that? Because that is a very good thing to bring up, but anyway, just what do you think about that? Okay. we can take it as far as you want.
Okay. Well, Rahu and Ketu are like, boy, they're my favorite part of astrology. So I could talk for hours about Rahu.
Okay. Well, let's not talk for hours. Let's just talk a few minutes.
Elements on Rahu and Ketu is that there's few ways of looking at this. And this is just how I'm looking at it. Don't go digging in traditional texts and writing me saying, oh my God, this is not what Parashara said.
Yeah.
This is my perspective.
True, but there will be some internet trolls that will say those things. So anyway,
go with that.
Yeah, that's fine.
I'm looking at Rahu and Ketu as representing ether element.
Okay. Ether.
Ether, yeah.
Because they don't have a body or what?
Well, yeah, they don't have a body, but also because I think they're similar to Jupiter in the sense that they're subtle in nature. They're not embodied. What it means that they're not embodied is that they're not gross in nature. They're not manifested at that level. They're subtle in nature, and that's the subtlest element is ether. And by the time you move out of ether, you've moved into embodiment.
Right.
And Jupiter, of course, manifests something about that in a profound way, which is why Jupiter gets the ether element associated with it. But Rahu and Ketu do as well. And there's another way of looking at Rahu and Ketu, which is also looking at Rahu as water element and Ketu as fire element.
Okay. I was with you on the Ketu as fire element. The water, that's interesting. I don't think I've heard that one before. I always thought Rahu was associated with air.
Right. That's another thing that's also in text. Now, I'm drawing here primarily from some of the Buddhist tantras.
Okay.
That discuss Rahu and Ketu in terms of like the yogic anatomy. And they discuss Rahu and Ketu as water and fire. And they also relate it to what they call the white and red constituents, which is basically the semen and the ovum. And the relationship between that and the spinal column, the Sushumna Nadi and all of that. Sushumna is primarily an ether element Nadi. And that's considered to be the domain of Rahu and Ketu from the Buddhist perspective.
Oh no, we're gonna have to do
there's a whole discussion. There's all kinds of reasons why we would be looking at it in both ways being true: ether, water, and fire. But I like ether as a general way of looking at it, just overall. And one of the ways I like to think about that is also that I feel like there's a strong relationship between Jupiter and Rahu and Ketu. And, Jupiter is, one way you could look at this is that Jupiter or the guru is the one who can awaken, those forces within us. So that's why they share the ether element. So there's a lot we can go with that. I just wanted to
yeah, I would love to dig more into that. We might have to do a whole other video on that now that we've talked about it, because okay, so just to be sure, you're saying that when we're looking at the elements relationship to Rahu and Ketu, ether is the one you attribute it to ether, correct?
Right.
Okay. All right. So we're just going to say that for now. And then at some point in time, whether we do it on this channel or in the actual Ayurveda and astrology class that we do, I think we should spend some more time exploring Rahu and Ketu and all these different ideas that you discussed, because I think I find them interesting, and I think others would find them interesting as well. So you all right with that?
I'm cool with that.
Okay, good. All right. So good. So we've gone through all of the planets related to their elements, and these will be things that will serve as the building blocks as we get into more detail with Ayurveda and astrology. So thanks a lot, Neeshee, and we'll be back shortly with the video talk dealing with prana and astrology.
Thanks, Ryan.
Yep.